Fighting game remakes are shockingly rare in the genre. I suppose companies think, why remake a fighter when they can just update it with the same engine and everything? Just have to do a balance patch essentially, maybe add a character or two, and voila, a brand new game. With a lot of classic fighters having 2D sprites, remaking those is a tall order. So it's mostly gonna end up being 3D models and probably not satisfying anyone no matter how good they look. Let me get one thing straight here. I'm not talking about updated versions of a game or remakes of games, regardless if it's a portable port or something that's a cute side mode. And of course, not remasters and reboots. You know it when you see it, but a remake uses the original game as a template, but builds it from scratch with new assets and gameplay elements. The remaster versus remake debate line certainly gets blurred quite a bit, which I'm sure we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And here's that bridge now with Virtua Fighter Remix. The original Virtua Fighter launched day one with the Sega Saturn. In the US, it was even a pack-in title. On paper, this was genius since Virtua Fighter was a graphical showcase at the time, being lauded as the next evolution not only in fighters, but video games as a whole. Due to Sega being in a rush to beat the PS1 to market, the Saturn released slightly before it in all regions of the world and was quickly outdone by the competition. Even with Virtua Fighter as a launch title, the PS1 offerings with Battle Arena to Shinden and Tekken 1 quickly outdid it. The polygons in Virtua Fighter were so flat and barely textured. Look at Tekken and it has more complex polygons and highly detailed textured characters and stages. In a response to prevent their graphical darling Virtua Fighter from being outdone, Sega quickly released Virtua Fighter Remix. The graphics were redone to make the character models not as simplistic and flat and have detailed textures as well. The stages are slightly improved, but only the 3D platform your characters are standing on, not the still image background in the distance. This game performs a bit smoother too, since there's no pop-in from the stages if you change angles quickly. Other than that, this was the same game. As far as I know, I don't think balance was adjusted or new moves added. Even if they were, this is still as bare bones as the original release. No new modes or even a new soundtrack here. In the US, this could be redeemed via mail-in order for free if you had proof of purchase of the Saturn in a certain time window. In Japan, this was just sold at a reduced budget price. The game was released in the arcades as well, with an arcade board based on the Saturns, so pretty much the same game. This probably didn't move the needle much for Saturn sales since the damage had already been done. I think it would have just made more sense for Sega to wait to release this, or not at all, since Virtua Fighter 2 was just around the corner. Sega was doing all kinds of goofy shit in this generation, though this one is just a drop in the bucket in hindsight. Virtua Fighter 1 got another remake in Virtua Fighter 10th Anniversary Edition. In Japan, this released as a standalone game with a Virtua Fighter History DVD, but in the US, it was a mode in Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, which is the ideal way to do it in my eyes. PAL regions, I don't know how you guys got this game since it was never sold at retail and it allegedly released through a promotional giveaway only. This game walks the line between remake of Virtua Fighter 1 and demake of Virtua Fighter 4 since it has the whole cast from the fourth game. But the flat polygon graphics, soundtrack, and stages are from Virtua Fighter 1. It runs much smoother since it's on the VF4 engine, and the moves and victory animations are ripped from that game. We do have the VF1 slow moon jumps though, so that gameplay aspect is retained. This concept is one of the best ideas for a fighter ever, and I'd love to see like a Tekken 1 remake demake with Tekken 8's engine and roster. I think that would be something so novel and a perfect fit for a bonus mode in Tekken 8. Keeping the VF streak going with Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown. This being a remake of the poorly aged title Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown. Ultimate Showdown was made with a completely new engine called the Dragon Engine, the same engine used for the Yakuza series. The remake has a heavier focus on online play, and that's great and all, but what it really needed was some decent single-player content. Cosmetic DLC is also available in Ultimate Showdown with collabs from Yakuza and Tekken. Not a full guest character or a stage, but we got the music from both and a lot of great costumes. Despite its shortcomings, this port seemingly did very well and might be the Trojan horse we needed for Sega to greenlight Virtua Fighter 6. I'm sure it didn't hurt this was kind of free via PS Plus, but I'm not complaining as long as we get a new entry in the series. I'm happy this game exists. The last Virtua Fighter remake actually came out after Virtua Fighter Remakes, this one being a chibi remake of Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Fighter Kids. This was supposed to be a more kid-friendly version of Virtua Fighter, and it chibifies the entire cast of the second game. It has pretty much the same control scheme and mechanics, so it's a little weird to me this game even exists. It's very charming, but I assume this was meant to attract a younger audience. If it's just the same thing as the main game though, why not have them play that? Regardless, the remade stages are pretty neat, and the very expressive faces of the fighters help sell the more cartoony tone they're going for. This game does offer unique character endings for the first time in the series, and maybe only time. So, not a huge addition, but something I wish the series continued doing. Frequent notes taker of Virtua Fighter, Dead or Alive, had an incredible remake of DOA 2 with the Xbox Classic exclusive Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate. This game truly was a graphical showcase on the classic Xbox and looks drop-dead gorgeous to this day. The stages almost look unrecognizable with how much detail is packed into them. The lighting engine does this game so many favors, and Team Ninja knew what they had since some stages is just them showing off. The roster is pretty much the exact same as the original game, with the addition of Hitomi from DOA 3. They might as well just add the other characters from DOA 3, since I feel it's not a crazy amount of extra work, since Hitomi doesn't have a story mode anyways. This version had a heavy emphasis on online play through Xbox Live. I think this might have been the first fighter I've ever played online. I remember it being not too bad to work with, but I might be misremembering that since this was like the only online fighter that I played. There's additional costumes that weren't in the original, as well as brand new stages and moves, my favorite being the unlockable bonus mini documentary made by G4. This very selectively edited version of the episode was a great window for me to peek into how the series came about. Also to see #1 Tekken fan Tomonobu Itagaki himself. This game, as of now, is still available on the Xbox Marketplace and is backwards compatible with the Xbox One and Series X. The physical version comes with the Saturn port of DOA 1 as well. In my opinion, this remake might be my favorite one we talk about here. Basically a new coat of paint over DOA 2, but to be fair, it's a very nice coat of paint. The extra additions mentioned earlier make this easily the definitive version of 2 and probably one of the best DOAs in the series. Some games are just remade with only the graphics being the major difference, that again creates that gray area between remake and remaster. Like, yeah, Plasma Sword and Tech Romancer's arcade version, compared to their Dreamcast versions, does show a pretty big jump in graphics between the different hardware being used, but these don't really qualify as remakes to me. I go back and forth between if Soul Calibur's Dreamcast version could be considered a remake, because this is a pretty big difference when you compare them side by side. For a more insane difference though, look no further than Tekken Tag 1. The arcade version is essentially a slightly better looking Tekken 3 while keeping that PS1 look, but only a few months after the arcade release, the PS2 version dropped, and goddamn, this is a quantum leap from the arcade version. The music is redone, and the stages actually have people walking around in them. This game has the appearance of a full-on remake. The arcade version is like what Tag 1 could have looked like if this was ported to the PS1 instead, and it would have been an impressive PS1 game, don't get me wrong. But the PS2 version was such a beast. As a launch title, this was one of the first PS2 games people got to even see and truly grasp the difference of power with this new console. But is this actually a remake given such a short time difference between the arcade and PlayStation 2 releases? The game seems to be on a completely different engine, and the difference here is more noticeable than certain remakes nowadays. I would probably chalk this up to being an updated port, but I'll let you guys be the judge. For me, what justifies a remake is when it can go back and fix the mistakes of the original with a modern perspective, while adding a fresh coat of paint by tweaking the graphics to be more appealing for a new generation of fans. What happens if you do none of that? Well, you get King of Fighters 94 Rebout. This was a remake of the first KOF. It came out in late 2004, and by this point there were at least 10 mainline KOF entries, with the most recent at the time being KOF 2003. So you'd think KOF 94 Rebout would take the lessons learned from the series to make this a worthy remake. Nah, they just drew over the old sprites and made some 3D backgrounds. I'm sure there's some balance tweaks here, but this is overall pretty faithful to the original KOF 94, which is not a good thing. The AI difficulty spikes, the stiff fighting, and limited roster are all here. The graphics, I'm sure as you can tell, just look unappealing, and I feel the charm of the original pixel graphics is something I vastly prefer. The new sprites here just look like the smoothing effect was cranked all the way up. Let's focus on the positives for a moment. The stages are pretty cool, even if they are a bit overly stuffed on cameos. These stages go places, man, and I think are really creative remade versions of the classic KOF 94 stages. People could argue they're a bit overdesigned, but I just like that they're kinda going nuts in these versions. I do think overstuffing each stage with random cameos can be a bit much, but it's just a nitpick for me. The redone soundtrack, also pretty great while keeping the spirit of the original game, so well done there. You can also make custom teams unlike the original by mixing and matching characters. That all being said, those graphics and gameplay faults are hard to look past. The main game people probably think of when hearing fighting game remake is Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. I remember being pumped for this game and seeing the redone sprites made by Udon, who made the incredible Street Fighter comic series, and thinking this game was gonna move like Street Fighter 3. No clue where I got that idea. I could have simply just seen a video for this game and got grounded right back to reality. But I was a really young and dumb kid, so I just let my imagination run wild. None of this is the fault of the game, but just my own foolishness. This was faithful to Super Turbo, and the look of the characters was vastly improved. Don't get me wrong, I love the classic sprites. Sagat was buff as hell, M. Bison was a lot more intimidating, and Ken just looked way cooler. The songs for the stages were done by the music remix community site OC Remixes, and all of these are top notch. They're much more experimental remixes than most people are used to. I particularly like Ryu's theme and M. Bison's theme. Something I've said in other videos is how the stages here aren't bad, but they are lacking. The energy seems to be sapped from them compared to the original versions. The animation of the background characters is cut down, and the audience themselves seem to be fewer in numbers for some stages. According to producer Ray Jimenez, this is due to the game being a digital title, and they had to cut down on details and animations for the stages so that it could reach a certain file size. That's probably a big reason, but I'm sure they were rushed a bit to release this before Street Fighter 4 as well, so it helped to cut corners where they could. I mean that in a good way actually, since I'm sure this team was relatively small and the scope of this project was probably way bigger than they had planned. So if corners had to be cut somewhere, I suppose it's best it was the stages. Gameplay, as mentioned earlier, is mostly Super Turbo. The team at Backbone did rebalance the game though, which was a controversial choice to the ire of fans. Special move inputs could be changed for some characters, making some specials feel a bit more natural. This doesn't have too much in terms of features. You can play online and local, or play the CPU in arcade mode. That's about it. This game did have a sequel exclusive to the Switch called Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challengers. This had the same Udon sprite and background art as HD Remix, but the soundtrack was redone again to something a bit safer and more generic. The balance was tweaked yet again to be more like the original Super Turbo. Included are palette swaps of Ryu and Ken being Evil Ryu and Violent Ken respectively. These characters are busted, but super fun versions to play. I know these were probably really easy to make, but I'm glad they did. We do have a bit more to chew on for single player offerings. There's Dramatic Battle, which appeared in the Alpha series. In this mode, you have two characters who share the same health bar go up against some bosses from Street Fighter 2. I wish you could have mixed the matchup in this mode a bit more. Maybe having two friends against just you, or fighting more characters than just the bosses in Bison stage. Included is a Street Fighter art book in its entirety, online play that I'm sure isn't that active now, a color editor, and a first-person mode called Way of the Hado. This uses the engine from Street Fighter 4 and has you use the Joy-Cons to perform Ryu's specials. It kinda works. When you get swarmed and try to do moves quickly, that's where the game has trouble reading inputs, but if you do them slow enough, it can be pretty accurate. Accurate or not, this gets repetitive quickly, and it doesn't go past that initial novelty. The folks at Backbone Entertainment pitched a Darkstalkers HD remix to Capcom, and the only proof of this is a Morrigan sprite done in the Udon style. This would have been amazing to see, but would have been a far more ambitious project than Street Fighter 2. I mean, have you seen the Darkstalker sprites in action? Backbone would certainly have their work cut out for them, and unfortunately, they never got the chance since Capcom rejected this idea, forever proving everyone wants to make a new Darkstalkers except Capcom. While we're in the neighborhood of cancelled remakes, the first 3 Mortal Kombat games were also supposed to get HD remakes with all new actors, and the fatalities, moves, and stages all redone. It seems like WB didn't want to foot the bill for a project this ambitious and expensive, so they just made a remaster of the original trilogy instead, and everybody loved that. In addition, there was another remake in the works, but only for the original Mortal Kombat game, and sadly that was cancelled too. I highly recommend checking out Matt McMuscle's What Happened on this exact topic, and he even goes over the 3rd remake attempt. There is actually a remake of a Mortal Kombat game that came to realization, and that's Ultimate MK3 on the iPhone. I actually owned this game before Apple purged all the games I bought, and you'll notice it doesn't use digitized actors, but 3D graphics, and yeah, it looks a little Jankenstein. Even if this game looked amazing, you control this on a touchscreen. That touchscreen control scheme kills any interest people could have had with this game. No legit way to play this anymore since Apple, when changing their OS over the years, has slowly made games like this no longer compatible. You want to talk about the system with the worst preservation, it's probably mobile games. I can't think of a reality of a fighting game ever being remade in this day and age, even if it's by a smaller independent studio. The IP holders of these franchises wouldn't do it themselves anyways. I think they view fighting games as disposable. Once the new thing is out, there's almost no need to release remade older stuff. At least that's how I assume they see it. Besides, it's much easier for a company to release an updated port, so no assets really have to be changed from the ground up, just tweaking the existing ones. Best we can hope for is when games do a backdoor method of remakes. What I mean is when Street Fighter V added an arcade mode, you could replicate the arcade mode for all of the games in the Street Fighter series. Sure, not every single character is represented, but I wonder if other games could take this a step further. A game like Tekken 8 almost has the entire original roster of the first Tekken already baked in the game. What if you could play a Tekken 1 arcade mode with redone endings for those original 8 characters? Virtua Fighter 4 10th Anniversary kinda does this with the Virtua Fighter 4 engine and having essentially a remake of VF1 while using VF4 as a skeleton. Because if a standalone remake for a fighter releases, that may be a much harder sell. Would a Tekken 3 remake do well, even as a smaller digital title? Somehow, I doubt it. Even remasters of fighters struggle selling, like Marvel vs. Capcom Origins or Tekken Tag 1 Hybrid. Developers essentially have to treat a remake as a reboot to sell it as a brand new game in the vein of Killer Instinct or MK9. It just bums me out that in a time where remakes are more prevalent than ever, that we don't really have any for fighting games. It would greatly advance the genre if a small team had a wildly different approach to a game that we're already familiar with.